Professor Tootle, how are you today?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing well. As you know, I've been sick much of December. So as far as like planning goes, I didn't do it normal, not planning. But in addition, I've been sick, so I just had no desire to do any planning. So I've done extensive research on today's topic. Do you think I'm lying or?
I think you're lying.
Yeah, yeah,
We've all been sick. Everyone's sick. I've been sick. I mean, my last few. I think even on the last show, my voice was shot,
yeah,
and
mine too.
yeah, just so I feel like I've had my first 3 healthy days in the last couple days.
Yeah, and then I went and got the COVID booster, and then because I was so sick, I didn't want to get COVID because I think I had the flu, and then that knocked me out again for 2 days. So I was just like, geez, I'm over this stuff. Anyway, we're not talking about health today,
Yeah.
but I'm glad you're semi-healthy, gentlemen. Looks like all gentlemen so far on the call. Welcome. So, Professor, I had how does that called, a surprise by talking to a friend last week, which is why I chose today's topic. And he said, and I invited him to the meeting, but maybe you can watch this afterwards. He said, we're at this end stage capitalism, John. And first of all, I don't know what that means. And I did do a little Google research to kind of see what that means. But it actually, without even knowing what it means, it kind of surprised me. I have this worldview, and this is where I guess wokeism.
I lost your audio there for a second after the word worldview. Is it just me?
No, I haven't. I'm not hearing it either. So
okay, let's see.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, gotcha.
Where'd you lose me?
At the word worldview. You have a worldview.
Yeah, a worldview that capitalism is a pretty good thing. It's kind of what makes America America. It's one of the key pillars of our society. It's actually special. It's worth valuing and honoring. And sure, there's things that you have to have a level playing field. I mean, there's all sorts of nuances to it. It's not just pure capitalism. And I think there's probably very few pure capitalists. But generally, it's a positive thing. And my friend has a real negative connotation of capitalism, that it's evil, it's bad, it's not good for people, it's unhealthy. And so anyway, I figured let's get a little bit of a historical perspective from you. I have two main categories that I'd like to ask you about. And you probably have three others that are more important. So here's my first question to you. With that kind of premise about capitalism, I'd like you to outline in general terms, not the founding of our country, the pre-country, the original Western settlers. Because it was an interesting revelation to me as well. And I want to go back to a book that you recommended, which was, I think it was Edmund Morgan, maybe, American Slavery, American Freedom.
Yep.
I think that's the book. And it talked about the settlements of the different colonies and how most Western civilization got here and what kind of people they were and what they were fighting for, or maybe weren't fighting for, they were just here under circumstances. Can you give that? Because to me, that's kind of the basis of which the Constitution and Declaration and Constitution were founded on. Is that there's that couple 100-year history before, both good, American freedom, and bad, American slavery. Now we've done a bunch of shows on slavery, so we don't need to concentrate on that unless you think it's important under the auspices of capitalism. Can you give the is it? Am I right? Is it in our bones in America that we're capitalists?
Sort of. Kind of. And really, what it is, is you're taking a term from a later era and you're applying it to an earlier era. And it's the same thing that people do with all kinds of concepts. You say like race or racism, or you're taking this thing that has a specific meaning in a specific time, and you're applying it to people in an earlier time who didn't necessarily share that worldview or those concepts. So I would say that, I guess first I would want some sort of definition of what other people think capitalism is, because at a very basic level, just the recognition that an individual can have property the word capital just means thing, property. It's the same root as the word cattle and chattel. It just means, thing. Like, this is a thing. Like, this coffee cup is mine. It's a thing. It's it's a thing that can be bought, sold, or traded without violence. So as far as the founding of the country goes, the people who founded each of the colonies had a different reason why they believed it was important to protect rights. And protecting rights means committing yourself to a system of peaceful negotiation. And among the things that must be peacefully negotiated is, how do you handle the physical and material objects in the universe, like a thing. And what one thing might be your house or your wages or your wealth or whatever. And so if I were to use the term, it is a necessary but not sufficient condition to protect property rights. But if we recognize that what made it possible for all the colonies to come together was a protection of many liberties that we in other episodes have called pluralism. Of those many rights that you have the right to be left alone with your and part of leaving you alone is not taking away your stuff. And so, to me, I shy away from using the word capitalism. I mean, even Marx rarely used the word capitalism. He used the word capital a lot. And other socialist thinkers kind of popularized the term as an insult to people who believed that that human beings can own things. So in a way, I think even using the term capitalism leads us to frame our questions incorrectly about what's important in life and how we should govern ourselves.
Okay, I love that answer, even though it was a gentle jab at me. I love that.
It's not a jab at you. It's just the way people talk now. I
Right.
mean, I understand that people use the word capitalism all the time. Like, I get it.
Fair enough. So my follow-up question, though, is at least by 1793, enshrined in the Constitution, it very specifically says the government shall not do all these things.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, by definition, they're ensuring that individuals get to make most decisions. And it specifically, I guess, in the 10th Amendment, it says states or individuals. But the bottom line is it's saying, perhaps for the first time in history, that people get to decide what they do with their property, their lives, their choices they make, and not government, not a king, not a monarch, not a dictator of whatever stripe. Is that correct?
Yes, but to understand it, I mean, I feel like we always come back to this point. Like, to understand pluralism is to understand that none of your rights are absolute. All of your rights are subject to negotiation within a legal framework. I mean, if the government has the right to take your life, the government has the right to take your property. And to acknowledge that is no concession. I always find it strange when people say, oh, you believe in fire departments, so you're a socialist or something like that. Or, the way people frame these debates is just so absurd. What we're talking about is setting up a system of peacefully negotiating between all of your rights. And that's what is enshrined in our legal system and our tradition.
Huh. So you disagree that it's setting up the framework for capitalism, even though those are the right words. That you're
Well, I guess I would
more
just say it is a necessary but not sufficient condition.
necessary,
Meaning
but
you
not.
and I'll use this. I have a friend who teaches economics, and he says the hardest thing to get people to understand is that it's supply and demand. They want it to be one thing or the other, but it's not. It's an axis. you don't get the correct answer unless you do supply and demand. So if it's hard to teach people that you need supply and demand, imagine how difficult it is for people who are supposed to teach civics, that you don't have, it's not just two rights that need to be protected. You have a bunch of rights that all need to be balanced and protected in a legal system. And of course, among these rights is your right to be left alone. And we've talked in previous episodes about your positive liberties and your negative liberties, your right to act in concert with your neighbors versus your right to be left alone in all circumstances. But all of these things go into a system where they are balanced against one another. And it's always why people like us and I'll have such a more difficult task, because totalitarians have answers. If you're a Nazi or a communist or a socialist or any other form of totalitarian thinker, you've got solutions to problems, and you've got answers to questions. And good old-fashioned Americans, we don't have solutions. We just have improvements that we have new ways of balancing rights, and that's why our task is always more difficult.
That's an interesting point. So I guess I want to interrupt our conversation with a follow-up question on that point.
Okay.
Aren't most Americans, although we don't act like it sometimes, I think we get wrapped up into weird arguments, but in reality, on our daily lives, aren't most Americans pretty rational or pretty centrist or pretty moderate? I mean, what percentage of Americans are fascists or far right, and what percentage of Americans are crazy communist or far left, or it's pretty few, isn't it?
Well, I would say even I always say, like,
I know you don't like left and right, so far.
Well,
sorry about that.
Yeah, it's there's a thing that we often say, which is we need to just preach what we practice. In other words, let me put it to you this way: most Americans, almost everybody in this civil society, understands that it's wrong to use violence to take something that is not yours. And we often fall into these tropes of describing ourselves using a bunch of ideologies that we don't really even believe in, because we would never do this stuff in our own lives, and we would clearly understand how unjust these things would be in practice. And I always say, I had an old professor who used to say, and I'm sure I've repeated this because I stole this idea from him, but he used to say, look what happens when you drop totalitarian ideologies into the United States, and they all get moderated. You drop capitalism, let's say you're somebody who is the stereotype of, I just believe that that property rights are supreme, and those are the only rights that need to be protected, and takes that to some extreme. Or you say, oh, I'm a socialist, and I believe that all property is owned in, or I want the government to control all the major means of production. Or someone's a communist and say, I believe that we should use violence and create a dictatorship of the proletariat. One of the reasons why people flirt with extremist ideas in the United States is because it's safe to do so here, as long as you don't actually do it. It's almost like a flirtation. So I always, this old professor of mine used to joke that you could give, and this, I've seen this a million times, you give students a bunch of readings by Karl Marx and they come away saying, well, I like this part about free textbooks. And you say, well, you're kind of missing the point, right? You can be for free textbooks without all this other stuff. And then, Americans will look at Hitler and say, oh, well, the freeway, he built the freeways. Kanye West says, oh, he built freeways. It's almost like people are looking for what can we use out of this incredibly dangerous ideology without really thinking about the ideology that comes with it. We're looking for ideas that we can plug into our pluralist political traditions, and in that case, we're as long as we have the pluralist political traditions and we're somewhat aware of it, and our elite institutions are still teaching them, that's not necessarily something to be feared. It's actually something that Americans can kind of be proud of, because our political system and culture moderates, or always has in the past, moderated extreme positions. So, I get it.
Another fascinating point. Really, I've never considered that, ever.
Yeah. So, we get somebody who's wearing his Adam Smith tie and, and claims to be some sort of ultra capitalist. And I always say, oh, you like Adam Smith, right? And they say, oh yeah, he's the best. And I say, theory of moral sentiments. It's like, oh, well, yeah, no, not that. You're like, yeah, why not read all of Adam Smith if you claim to like him? And I guess to bring it back to our point about capitalism is, if you believe that, let's say your Puritans believe that all property belongs to God, and that is your personal religious belief, and that God has given you sort of a role to play in your own life, which includes working and earning wages or acquiring property as part of God's plan for you, then you are a steward of that wealth on behalf of God. The government doesn't need to agree with you that property belongs to God. It just has to agree that it's going to leave you alone. Does that make sense? So we're protecting the property rights, and is part of the religious belief system, but it's part of what accommodates as many religious belief systems as possible. So I guess one of the things that is under-examined or understood is that the major reason why property rights are protected in the United States is, I don't know about the major, let's say a major reason why property rights are protected in the United States is because of the religious traditions of the people who founded most of the colonies. They wanted to be able to practice their religions, and part of practicing their religion was something that included the protection of property rights. But they would have also been familiar with the protection of property rights because property rights had been part of the tradition in English politics for 100 years before settlement. So, it was all part of what had been in the air for hundreds of years. By the time our Constitution and Declaration came around, at least, the English had been talking about property rights for 100 years. But the colonies that were founded before, Locke was writing, before pre-Glorious Revolution colonies, at least, still would have protected property rights as part of their religious freedoms.
Well, as always, you surprise me. I guess that's the difference between a political science degree and a history professor.
Yeah, there you go.
So, so Professor, now I want to skip to my next major question. I want to skip through the whole history of the United States. From 1793, you've given me lots to ponder on that, founding of our country to the Constitution. I want to go all the way up to 1940-ish. I have this premise that's probably wrong, that America is still, if not the bastion, but I think Ukraine is making the point that it is a significant bastion of freedom fighters, and a role model, a light, a beacon on the hill, for freedom, or the ability to determine your own destiny to the world. Now, we're not alone. There's lots of other partners out there. But it seems like that kind of got cemented in World War II. And for the decades after World War II, it seems like we became a global superpower. And it wasn't just power. It was an idea of power. It wasn't, just tanks and battleships. It was an idea. Up until at least the 80s, maybe 90s. It seemed like it was a long-serving tradition. And now in maybe the last 20 or 30 years, we've muddled it where I don't know that it was as strong during the 50s, 60s. But I think Ukraine may have resurged in that. It wasn't our deal. It was Putin's deal that made a re-emergence of that idea. Do you think I'm just off the deep end and have no idea what contemporary American politics is about? Does my question make sense? Is capitalism a part of the global ideal and worth fighting for? Or is it, no, it's so muddled that, no, that's not true, John. So correct me all you wish for the next 10 minutes, then we'll open it up for questions.
Well, I would say human rights are worth fighting for. Political pluralism is worth fighting for. And among the rights that are protected under human rights and political pluralism is your right to, earn your wage from the sweat of your brow, and to act freely as long as your actions don't conflict with, the rights of others. As for America's role in this, it's not something that we should fear when other countries are safe, prosperous, and free and protecting rights, because every other nation on earth that protects human rights is no longer a threat to the United States. It is in our national security interests for other countries to be safe and prosperous and free. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of trade if we somehow think that when other countries are successful, that somehow that hurts us. It's like saying, my beloved 49ers last night, are they somehow hurt by the competition in the NFL? You'd say, well, no, it makes the gameplay better. It makes the product better when you have this competition, but the rules are enforced equally upon everyone. So I don't know. I don't know if you were asking more from
Love that answer.
I was answering in a national security sort of context, but right. I guess that's how I hear the question posed most often, which is this bad for the United States? And I actually mean it one step higher, but it was a great answer. I love that for thinking. But capitalism in this setting from World War II to current is a virtue, is it not? Isn't it a positive word? Isn't it something that we should be advocating for? And you've in a previous conversation, you gave us a word you prefer better than capitalism. Well, I always say just peace, but it is a necessary but not sufficient condition, meaning it is one of the things that must be protected in a pluralistic system. So it is necessary. You cannot have peace or freedom without the protection of property rights. It is a necessary condition, but it is not sufficient. The mere protection of property rights is not enough. It has to go along with many other.
Well, let me ask it in this way, and not necessarily in a national security directly, but indirectly. There are plenty of other folks in this global world that don't subscribe to your statement you just made. I mean, like perhaps billions that really they just want to make sure they can feed their family better than another family. They don't believe in your 49ers analogy. They want money or power or fame or ego or some version of security for their own family. And that's been the history of the human race. Still to this day, it may be the majority, correct or wrong?
Yeah, most human beings live in a system of innate an innate understanding of what they would consider justice, and most of the time that would include some kind of an understanding that people keeping their word and not using violence in order to advance their cause is better in the long run. But it's kind of, I don't want to say irrelevant, but the truth of the American founding ideals does not depend on whether other people believe in them. The truth of the ideals comes from their demonstration over hundreds of years. So, I mean, in essence, the question is not, have we created a paradise on Earth? The question we're here to answer is, can human beings govern themselves from reflection and choice? And reflection and choice means peacefully.
Yeah, I like that answer. So do you have any, one tiny question before we see if there's other questions. Do you have any idea what my friend is talking about, that America is an end stage capitalism, and that's probably a good thing because we're going to go to something else? Do you have any, what does that mean?
In a way, I guess it's kind of interesting and fun to think about these issues, but, I've heard interesting arguments about what will we be because of machines and energy. Machines and energy and artificial intelligence means that human beings can make and manufacture and live with not a lot of labor. If all you're trying to do is live a life, we can do that pretty easily. I mean, so the excesses of what a free market produces, the protection of property rights, it's sometimes fun to think about, what does it mean for civilization or humanity that we now are so incredibly wealthy, that the things that the social problems that were based on scarcity, what happens for humanity when those things go away? I mean, that's an interesting question to me. And I think what your friend is probably getting at is probably he or she was thinking about how, what does it mean when, although I don't know. Some people say, well, we're running some of it's based on this kind of old Malthusian argument that we're running out of resources. I've heard that kind of thing before, or that the world is becoming too crowded. That's another sort of argument. In other words,
I think, Professor, I'm not positive, but I think it's based off, and this friend I believe is probably in a higher socioeconomic status than you are, a college professor, which is probably a fine socioeconomic status. I think he's probably equal or greater than you from that standard. I think he truly believes, though, that, or doesn't believe in your statement. I think it's based off the fact that there are tens of millions of Americans, or maybe 80 million, I don't know. There's a lot of Americans that are not reaching the American dream, that really are struggling, that are within paycheck to paycheck, and they don't own their home, they're renting, and they're a health issue away from bankruptcy and a life of misery, not happiness. I think it's based off an economic concern, and that there's billions of other people around the world that sure their lifespan has increased and their quality of life has increased over the last decades. Still ain't good. And there's billionaires out there, and that he's pissed. I think it's based off that. Does that make some sense?
I guess, but your friend must have an incredible knowledge of the individual hopes and dreams of hundreds of millions of people, which I just don't presume to know. I kind of think that most people are, I don't know what the American dream is for everyone. What they would like to achieve, or the answers to those questions tend to be pretty darn individual.
So in theory, I appreciate and applaud that answer, but there is data, which you love data. There are data points out there showing the discrepancy between the super rich and the pretty poor. And there's still lots of pretty poor, and there's a lot of, well, it's a much smaller number, but there's a lot of really damn pretty rich. The rest in the shrinking middle class, in other words.
Well, but that is the result of the middle class getting wealthier. So the gap grew, but it wasn't because middle class people got poorer. It was because of, there were several trends that are kind of happening simultaneously. One is that people who are in the poorest quintile stopped moving out of the poorest quintile. So you have this, group of, maybe, and I'm overstating all of this, but sort of the bottom 20% are now staying as the bottom 20%. And then you have the next few quintiles that moved up because of their wealth accumulation, which creates a larger gap between the people in the bottom 20% and kind of everyone else in society. And I think it's more interesting to study why that bottom 20% has stagnated over the last 50, 60 years, and which groups of Americans do not stagnate as part of that bottom 20%, because there are people who are poor who do not stay poor and move out of that bottom quintile. But it tends to be, again, I'm generalizing, it tends to be immigrants and people who are native born Americans are the ones, poor native born Americans are the ones who tend to not have any or have a lot less income mobility. So I find that troubling. We're doing something to the bottom 20% of Americans that is trapping them. And I think that there are, and there have been, and there are, I'm going to sound like a wacky lefty here, but there are these institutions of in American society that have created barriers of entry as part of preserving their own privileges, that they assuage their own guilt through virtue signaling, while not actually caring that what they're doing is preserving their own privilege and trapping another group of people in multi-generational poverty.
Can you give an example or two? Because I think I'm following you, but I'm not sure.
Oh, I mean, I live in California, so the biggest example of this is housing policy, right? And what we see is, if you're somebody who claims to be a good human being, in California, you're like, oh, we need more money for housing, and then it means public housing projects, and that means that you're a good person, right? Because you advocate for affordable housing, right? But what advocating for affordable housing is essentially doing is making it possible for fewer houses to be built, which preserves the value of your property, so that your property value stays high, but you still get to feel like a good person because you advocate for public housing. What would actually cause...
So you mean everybody still wants the value of the single family home standalone property? Everybody still wants that, but there's not going to be as much of that. There's going to be apartments or condos or something.
Yeah, you could also allow more houses to be built.
Yeah, I think I'm following you on that. Okay.
But instead of allowing more houses to be built, I mean, it seems like it is the most uncontestable, easy to understand issue in the world, that if you don't allow more houses to be built, that houses are going to be more expensive. So if you want people to have affordable housing, build more houses. But if you say, well, we're not going to do that, but I still don't want to feel guilty. So what I'm going to advocate is large-scale public housing. And
okay, it's an interesting point. I've got your point now.
But there's also, we could do it in education, in politics. I mean, you could, in almost every aspect of American society, there's something that people who are in power, something that they are doing that acts as a subsidy. Most of the time it's complexity. Just mere complexity and regulation is in fact a subsidy that preserves the privilege of rich people, because it means that only people who can afford lawyers can participate in this activity. Or
accountants and lawyers and super high managers.
Yeah, but at the same time, people who want to feel like heroes will often advocate for more laws and more regulation in an attempt, but when what they're really doing is regulating their own privilege into permanence, and trapping people in lower income levels. And then they advocate for things that make poverty better rather than get people out of poverty. And I've always thought of that as being just, I don't know, hypocritical and short-sighted. When you're in poverty, you don't want to make poverty better. You want to get out. And it's a common trait sometimes among rich people who often somehow think that poverty is ennobling, and nobody who's ever actually been poor thinks that poverty is awesome. It isn't. It's not fun. It doesn't make you, the absence of money doesn't automatically make you a better person. It often leads to desperation and taking actions that are not in your long-term best interest, because you have such short-term needs to try to fulfill. So I get it. Your friend, I don't know. I don't want to read too much into your friend's statement about late stage capitalism, but I'll just say, like, I don't know. I hear stuff like that all the time too.
Okay. Well, and it probably won't be, well, who knows? I said, hey, why don't we debate it? And he goes, well, I'm not sure what I mean. And I go, oh, cool, I get it. I'm not sure what I mean about a lot of stuff either, but we probably will do that debate, but I'll have him watch this show first. So at least we'll have a level playing field on our discussion. So, Professor, what I guess I've asked too many questions. I need to get to see if Bart or Steve, or Tony, have any, maybe Ben if he's still on. What did you think we were going to talk about? Is there something? Oh, John, here's the big picture you missed. Appreciate you wanted to talk about capitalism, great, but boy, you're the teacher. What did we miss? What should we have been talking about today? And then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Well, I think the big picture for me is to understand the idea that protecting somebody's property rights, to not use violence when, it's funny, we all understand it when we understand that slavery is wrong. You take somebody who says, I hate capitalism, and you say, well, how do you feel about slavery? Because slavery is the ultimate activity where you're saying that this is not a person, that the person is property, and this person is not entitled to choose where they work, nor are they entitled to receive property of their choosing in exchange for their own labor. It is the ultimate, slavery is the ultimate anti-capitalist activity. And I think the person who thinks of themselves as being an anti-capitalist, if they truly understood that, that to be against the idea that a human being has individual rights, and among these rights is to be left alone, to choose where to work, to choose how much to work, to choose what you will receive in exchange for your labor, and then to keep what you have earned. I don't know that a lot of people who oppose capitalism really think about what they might be for, because to be for an individual being left alone to earn, to keep, to determine their own lives, it is so fundamental to what it means to be for human rights. But as I said, it is necessary but not sufficient. It's that what we want is that plus more. That's not enough, but we do need it. It is among the things that we need in order to say we're for human rights.
Lovely. I appreciate that. And that was a nice, succinct comment towards the end. That was awesome, Professor. Well done. So, team, hopefully we've inspired a question or two, either something we've missed or something you disagree with, something you like. What are your questions? Tony, you took yourself off mute. Do you have one?
Yeah. So I think so earlier this week, somebody on one of the groups that I'm in, maybe even the Bridge group, posted, basically it was a short video explaining the wealth gap between Black and white people. And what it did is it traced a historical perspective, which I found interesting, which was that Black people as slaves were considered capital. That's how you measured your wealth, was by the number of slaves you owned, and that part of the problem with the way that everything has developed is they've never been given. So capitalism grows by this generational nature, right? It's like, I get a bunch of property, wealth, I pass it on to my family, I pass it on to my family. And that Black people in general have been cut out of that process, with redlining and things like that. So it was a really interesting perspective I had. So there's
And that was John Hodge that posted that on the Bridge group. So yes,
Yeah,
I watched that video as well. Thanks for raising it. I don't think you watched the video, Professor, but do you have a thought or response on that?
I mean, it's true that there are, as I said earlier, there are these multi-generational wealth accumulation processes that people were excluded from, and it keeps them from. But these are all, I guess, to draw back to our discussion today. But these are all the result of the rejection of capitalism. I mean, it's not the result of capitalism. This is the result of capitalism's rejection. So it's not a condemnation of the free market system. If anything, it's an argument for the necessity of free markets.
And Professor, you still concur that seminal, I think might be the right word, Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom is a kind of a seminal understanding of the founding of our country, including this discussion on how people lived and what they believed in and what we should admire too, or is it still a seminal work, or is there other ones that on this topic that we might also reflect on?
I mean, there are newer books, and I've got my stack of 15 books that I'm going to try and read over Christmas break. Let's see. I've got The Revolutionary. I've got Need to Know, Classified, Coming to Terms with John Kennedy, Indivisible, The Last Campaign, a couple books on J. Edgar Hoover, and I've got like a bunch of books on Jefferson Davis, believe it or not. Precisely, and one of the reasons is I want to start studying how the South understood themselves in their anti-capitalism. Because it is a rejection of the framework of the founding and how they ended up coming up with this set of ideals. And I mean, basically, nothing I've read is contradicted. That basically what you had was a bunch of people who wanted slavery. They wanted to preserve their own privileges, and then they made whatever argument they needed to make in order to preserve their own privileges. And the same thing happens today, right? People who are self-interested argue for whatever it is that preserves their privileges. And so, am I shocked when people do it now? No, I'm not shocked that people want to try to preserve their own privileges. Everyone wants to try to, no one wants competition. If you think about it, like if you were, again, getting back.
Wait, don't we want competition? Your 49ers example. Sure, we want.
Hold on. Let me say it. We want competition, but if you're actually in the game, right?
But you just want to win.
The advantage. Yeah. Like you want your team to have the advantage, but you theoretically understand that what makes all teams better is preserving the competition. But that doesn't mean that I want the 49ers to win every game. I want them to win in a blowout. I want the other team to never score. I want the defense 3 and out for them every time. And I want a touchdown on every time my quarterback hikes the ball. That's what I want. But I understand that what makes the game meaningful and good is that I don't get that.
Cool. Hey, Tony, you good with that, or you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I'm good with that. I appreciate it. And I'll say one last thing, or just one perspective, and it's probably not a question as much as so of course, when I was in college, I took a class from a bunch of Jesuits called the Philosophy of Karl Marx. And one of the things we did is we read Das Kapital, which was a really actually very interesting exploration of how capitalism works, like off surplus value of the worker and stuff like that. So it was a very it was mind shifting for me. And so I think it's something, instead of people going, oh, Marx or whatever, they should read, and let that inform their understanding of capitalism, or at least a examination of how surplus value creates capitalism, and how that dehumanizes the worker potentially. So.
Quick response to that, Professor.
Well, I would say, but you should be studying it as a way of understanding how, when an explanation flatters you, you're less likely to challenge its fundamental assumptions. I mean, the surplus labor of value of labor. I need to plug in my computer. It looks like it's about to die. I just got the warning, so hopefully I've got a little time here. But if I cut out, it means all right, surplus labor value. And I use this as an example. If I go off into the forest and I cut down a tree and I turn that tree into a canoe, then it is my labor that added the value to the raw material. And then I say, okay, well, I've just turned you all into a bunch of communists, because you understand that it is the value of the labor that added that added value to this product, and then anything that is not given back to the laborer is theft. But then I would always ask my class, okay, now buy my canoe. And they say, what? We're like, oh, well, I actually did this, and it took me 300 hours, and I think a decent living wage is $25 an hour. So you take the value of the canoe and the value of my labor. Now buy my canoe. And they say, well, I don't want a canoe. And I say, oh, that's right. How are prices set again? You don't actually, that's not where prices come from. It is the consumer who determines the value of the product. It's not, it can't be more than what the raw material is plus the labor. But the actual price of an item has nothing to do with the, well, I shouldn't say nothing to do. My economist friends are screaming if they're listening to this. It has to be less than the price, but it can't be more. And it's the consumer who determines the price. So the idea somehow that it is the laborer who adds the value to the raw material. And again, this is why people like to think about these issues. When energy and artificial intelligence and machines exist, who is it who's putting the value in, if that is in fact your belief system? You don't get to tell people, you can't force people to buy stuff that they don't want. And so
although some systems still try.
Well, yeah. But and when I'm being, actually, to bring it back to football, I sometimes use this old Dennis Miller joke about a sleeveless suit being 2 for 1. And he said, if they really wanted to screw you, they'd make you buy 3 of them. Like, nobody wants a sleeveless suit. Who would go around bragging, unless you're a professional wrestler? Why would you ever want a sleeveless suit? To show off your, your 24-inch pythons or whatever. But at any rate, I think it's important for understanding Marx, simply because you need to understand that a lot of people believed this stuff. I think for the same reason, I think it's important to understand slave owners, and I think it's important to understand Geronimo and every, you've got to understand all this stuff. But understanding something is not the same thing as saying this is true, by the way. Read it, and then at some point test it. I've always felt like that's the real, sometimes philosophers kind of poo-poo American pragmatism. And I would say, I've always liked this very American idea of saying, okay, we've now stated these things. Every now and then, let's take a step back and say, is this actually true? this, this, I understand that this is an okay theory. If you say the war on poverty, oh, it's been great, it's working great. And you say, is it over? Did we win? We have 60 years worth of data. Can we look at that and say, oh, what we've actually done is trapped a group of people in poverty, and poverty rate stopped going down once we launched the war on poverty? Are we not allowed to look at some of this data? Or to use your example, actually, to get back to that video you mentioned earlier, one of the things that's interesting to look at is wealth aggregation among, and then start accounting for things like non-native Black people, or Black people who attend elite universities, Black people who attend universities. I remember one of the data points from the crash of 2009 was in measuring who was most likely to get fired and least likely to be fired. The least likely person to get fired in the crash of 2009 was a Black woman with a graduate degree. And the most likely person to be fired was a Black male without a high school diploma. So one of those stats, again, you use your data point, demonstrates that the color of your skin is not the determining factor, it's other things. I don't know. Surplus theory. I'm going off on a lot of things, but all of this stuff just needs to be tested and debated and argued.
Gotcha. Thanks for those questions and responses. It looks like Bart's ready to take us down another path.
I don't know if it's another path, but one of the things I've realized, actually by participating in these discussions, is that a lot of times in this country we argue about, are our politicians socialists? Are they capitalists? The reality is, the way our country came together and everything, and this is just my impression, and I'm not a historian or anything, is that the economy we have in this country couldn't have really existed without the classical liberalism that the country is founded on. But what we really are arguing about in this country, especially in modern times, is not about whether we're socialists or communists or capitalists or anything like that. What we're arguing about is what should the government be doing for all of us with the money that the government collects. At the federal level, should it really only be national defense? I think there are people who frankly believe that. At the local level, you can get much more, granular about it. Like, I know Professor Tootle has lots of problems with what California is doing with its public money right now. And I think that's rightfully so. I think there are some things they're doing that are really weird. And we're getting to that point in Colorado too. We're not that far off. But, do you have any response to that, Professor?
Just to say that I think you're right. And, Bono agrees with you. I think that one of the, for years and years and years, people thought that the way to get rid of poverty had something to do with relief. And then we had this example after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where you had countries that were essentially poorer, the poorest places on earth, that 20 years later weren't anymore. And it has more to do with the political system that, the presence or absence of resources is not what determines the wealth of a nation or the well-being of any group of people. And so I think what Bono came to sort of understand is that this is what we need to be advocating for. Boring stuff like rule of law is what gets people out of poverty. rule of law, regulatory efficiency, the lack of corruption, protection of property rights. These are all the things that if you really want to get people out of poverty, that's what you should be advocating for. Because what freedom does is it allows for you to choose your own life. And not everybody, not everybody wants the same thing. So I just agree with you that it's a in many ways we have the wrong target. If what we're really trying to do is allow people to live lives of their own choosing, you can't actually make somebody be good, but you can create the preconditions for goodness to flourish. Does that make sense? Like, I can't, or it's just another fancier way of saying, like, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force him to drink. But at a social level, you can create the preconditions for a good society, but you can't actually make a good society. And often but you can't, you can't make a good culture, but you can create the conditions for a good culture to flourish. And the government can do a lot of things to destroy a culture too. In many ways, and this is when I worry about what we are in terms of late stage. I worry that we're in the late stages of a regulatory state that has put so many incentives into our everyday lives that we don't recognize all of the ways in which we are responding to these incentives in ways that are really taking away our, it's an overstatement to say freedoms, because we're all free to not respond to the incentive. But human beings respond to incentives, and so when we have such a regulated, when every part of American life is so incredibly regulated, there is almost no way to opt out anymore. Even if you say, I don't believe in the system, well, the system still believes in you. It's very difficult to be left alone. If you have kids and you send them to a school, or you're trying to decide where to send them to school, I looked it up the other week. There are only a handful of schools that don't take any subsidies or federal money. I think it's 50 something schools. And I've only heard of one of them. So practically every college you've heard of has built themselves around a federal system of incentives, and now exists as a spigot to receive these incentives. And almost every business is now complex enough that that's what they do. When I hear the announcement of a new business that is going to manufacture solar parts so that we can have more domestic solar in the United States, the first thing I notice is, well, what makes it possible is a $500 million subsidy from the government, and you say, oh, all right. And then again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying it is. These are all incentives that people respond to. Perhaps we have the best system for creating these incentives through representative government, but I worry about the role of this increasing complexity over American life over the last 50 years.
Interesting.
Hey, John, can I ask one more quick follow-up? along those lines, Professor, has American history actually had a period of time that has not involved the kinds of incentives you're talking about, where people were completely free to pursue their interests and live their lives?
It depends on what you mean by government and completely free. So,
Okay.
in a way, when there is no law and violence is still ruling, when you are encountering the wilderness, essentially, and then, in one sense, you are free from regulation, but you are not free from violence, which is worse. And there has never been a time when Americans, because we've always had this representative system, when Americans weren't getting together in order to create these incentives around the ways that they wanted to live. We're gonna dig canals. We're gonna build a transcontinental railroad. We're going to create the Northwest Ordinance and set aside land for education. We're going to have the Homestead Act, the largest. I mean, this is why there's no socialism in America, right? We already had the largest land redistribution in human history was the Homestead Act. The thing that every socialist said, oh, we want free land. Like, well, we just gave people land, right? So every one of those things was the result of a representative legislative process that created an incentive that altered people's behavior. So in that sense, you're right. Never been a time when that wasn't the case. And what, we sort of worry about when we say things like late stages is, are we now to the point where these things have all gone too far? And that's just something that I don't have an answer for. That's why we get to sit around and theorize about it and drink coffee and, talk about it over beers, because we all get to just guess.
Cool. Fair enough, Bart. Steve or Ben, quick questions. We're really up against our time frame for today, but if you have a quick comment or thought, this is the time to do it quickly.
Yeah, John, Steve, especially the first comment you made from your friend. When I hear people talking about the end of capitalism or what, we're coming to that point or something, I do hear that from time to time, and I hear a frustration that not so much the people I'm talking to, because they're probably doing okay, but either they're seeing other people get stuff and they're not able to live at the same standard, or even more so, they see other groups of people, the poorer people, not being able to work into the system. And so they're just saying out of frustration, capitalism has to end. We need a different system. But then they go to the things of socialism and giving stuff away without understanding the deep philosophy type stuff that Professor Tootle was talking about and understand what it really means. And they certainly don't have an alternative answer as to what's better. It's just out of frustration that whatever the system is, however it's working now, it's working really well for some people and a whole lot less well for other people. And that's just, they don't quite understand a better alternative, though, because I kind of read enough economics. I don't think there is a better alternative, but they're not accepting that as an answer.
Well,
I agree
100%, but what people often rail against is the special privilege that they see in our society, in our culture, the unearned privilege, the multi-generational unearned wealth, and you say that this is not just. And when somebody has an impulse to justice, we say, like, good. You're right. There is, any sort of innate sense of justice will have a problem with unearned privilege, and especially the attempt to preserve this unearned privilege. And we should understand that just how tempting it is to then gravitate towards people who say, well, I have the answer, because answers are satisfying. Right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But as I think I mentioned earlier, like, that's why our job is harder, because we're the ones who have to explain, we need to preserve a lot of rights, not just one. There is no single definition of a single right that should be preserved above all others. That what we need to remain committed to is the peaceful resolution of our legal issues within a system of rule of law. But that is going to be wildly frustrating. But, if you want it to be hopeful, sometimes I can turn it by saying, what if this person has any kind of gray in their hair? You can sometimes say, well, what was your definition of liberty 10 years ago? What was the frontier of liberty 20 years ago? What was it 30 years ago for you? What were you fighting for? And they might recognize that the things that they're fighting for now are different than the things that they were fighting for 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago. And you say, well, then this quest that we have for justice, you never get to hang up your spurs. We don't get to just say, oh, we're done now. Problem has been solved. And in a way that a Marxist or a Nazi gets to. They have a solution and they say it's going to lead to heaven on earth, and we have to keep scrapping for justice and finding that next frontier and trying to get at this unearned privilege and do away with it.
Well, I think we're going to end on that statement, unless, Ben, you have a compelling compliment or insult.
Consult.
No compliment, no insult today. Just trying to understand the concept of capitalism and social capitalism and capital socialism. And I'm just totally confused.
Well, at a very basic level, just think of capital as being cattle or chattel or thing, and think of every form of socialism as believing that you should have some sort of governmental structure that says that you don't have anything as an individual. It's a repudiation of individual rights.
And oddly enough, Professor, when I looked at Wiki, because that's the source of all things knowledgeable and powerful in the world and good, Wikipedia said America is a system based off capitalism and socialism. It's a combination.
Well, here's as I tried to say, like, Puritans did not believe that they had individual liberty. They believed that the government needed to recognize their individual liberty. Meaning they believed that God owned their property. But because they believed that God owned their property, that meant that the government needed to leave it alone for them. So does that make sense as a kind of analogy to explain this distinction? Like, if you're a Puritan, you believed that you did not individually own your property. You believed that God actually owns everything in the universe. But as far as this world is concerned and this government is concerned, that government needs to recognize or leave you alone in your religious belief that says that God has you managing your own life. So I don't know of any. It's an important distinction, I think, to always point out that if you're a socialist, you believe that your rights are of a social nature, and that is not what our system is based upon. You have individual rights, and some of these individual rights you practice with other people, and you do not lose your individual rights merely because you got together with other people. But that is not socialism. It is an understanding that you don't lose your individual liberties just because you join together with others.
We will end with that today.
Okay, sorry.
All right, Professor, thanks so much for your time. I don't know whether we'll do one next week or not. We'll talk a lot about that. But everyone, thank you for your interest in the topic today. Last call, Professor.
Yeah, Merry Christmas if I don't.